So hello, I'm John Kane, and I welcome you to Let's Talk Native on this Saturday, March 28th. March 28th is my grandson's birthday. So I'm going to wish my grandson, Talon, a happy birthday. Couldn't have a party, so we did one of those car parades in front of his house, beeping the horns and decorations. Yeah, we did that. All right. Anyway, today is Saturday, March 28th, 2020, the year that it is. While this program may not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do encourage and in some cases start conversations. We kind of break the rules here for Native radio. We don't do buffalo speeches. We don't do prayers. We don't practice in mysticism. We take a tough look at history, oppression, and survival. We talk about culture, the arts, politics, and identity. And we may step on a few toes along the way. But our real goal here is to bring people together by breaking down what separates us. We will take on the false narratives and provide critical thinking to all that is heaped upon us. And we do it all right here live from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. So let's talk Native. But first, let me remind people that our audio streams live on our website, which is www.letstalknative.com. We stream live video of the show, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. We stream live video of the show on Facebook Live, on a bunch of Facebook group pages, thanks to my wife, including our Facebook group page for Let's Talk Native. We take the audio and we put it up on SoundCloud, which goes out as a podcast on all your favorite podcast platforms. We take the video and we put it up on our YouTube channel, which is Let's Talk Native TV. So subscribe to our podcast, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you'll catch not only videos of the show with the YouTube channel in particular, but you'll also catch some of our short form videos that we do. I am the show's host and producer, but I'm joined here in studio by Jake Proud, who's managing our audio and our video, and contributes in a big way to the show. So I want to acknowledge that as well. All right, let's get into it. COVID-19, yes, we do have to talk about it, and it's not even that we have to because there's nothing else to talk about, but it is the dominant thing that we're dealing with right now. Do want to get into some of the numbers because, you know, if you only get your information from Facebook, you're limited on how current some of the numbers are. The world numbers at this point, 663,000 cases, 30,000 deaths. So all of you who thought this was, you know, just a minor thing, was never going to be as big as the flu and that kind of stuff, we're hitting those numbers. The United States, 123,498, so 123,005 for all intents and purposes. Total deaths are over 2,211 deaths. There are a significant number of serious cases yet. The United States has well blown past any other country in terms of total cases. They passed Italy and China almost within the same few minutes. The United States will surpass Iran and France for total deaths. Probably by tomorrow. They will surpass China within the next couple of days. China's got 3,300 deaths, total deaths, and the U.S. has 2,200, and they had over 500, almost 600 just today. Italy is still, just skyrocketing on this thing. Although their total cases are about 92,000. They have 10,000 deaths. They had almost 900 deaths just today. These numbers are. Here's what I got to say about the numbers. If you do the math, and again, these are just confirmed by test. So they are in the United States. Again, the United States still only has about 0.1% of the population tested. So and it's growing all the time, the amount of people they have tested, but it's still a small percentage of the overall population. But based on these numbers, there's a lot of debate on what is the mortality rate of this disease. If you base it on the numbers, the total numbers of the world, and the bigger numbers that you have, the more accurate the calculation is. If you do a calculation right now, and then here's how you do it, folks. If you want to do it at home, you take the total number of deaths and you divide that by the total number of cases. And if you do that, you're going to come out not at 1%, not at 2%. You're going to be coming out at like 4.7%, almost 4.8%. You're starting to get close to 5% mortality rate on this thing based on the global numbers. And that mortality rate is increasing. It's not going down as more numbers come in. So I think it's important that people realize that anybody who said, well, when anybody, I mean Trump, but anybody who says, well, I think the mortality rate's going to come in at a number, probably less than 1%. Well, that's not the way indicators are. That's not the way the trend is. Even in the United States, again, if you divide the total number of deaths, 2,200, by the total number of cases, 123,000, you're still going, it's still only 1.6, or 1.7%. But that number is getting higher as time goes on. And the United States should have a lower mortality rate because, of the science and the, what we think is a superior hospitals. And I'm not saying the healthcare is superior, but in general, there are pretty smart people, and we've got some, we should have better equipment, on this continent. But anyway, the numbers are starting to go the other way, where it's increasing. The mortality rate is not dropping down as more cases are exposed. It is actually, the mortality rate is rising. It's still well below the world rates, but here's the thing. Part of the reason the global numbers are higher in terms of mortality rate is because many of these countries have reached that point where they've overrun their hospitals. So they do have people who can't get ICU beds. They do have people who can't get put on ventilators. And again, I want to explain that again. Currently, the United States has not run out of ventilators to use in their hospitals. When they do, and when there ends up being this debate over who gets one, who doesn't get one, that rate of mortality rate is going to climb, because you're not going to have enough. Look, it's not even about the ventilator. It's enough hospital staff. It's about enough beds. It's all these things. Look, it's great. Turn the Javits Center into a hospital. Send a Navy hospital boat shipped to the port of New York. There's only 2 of those. And they're going to put one on the West Coast, one on the East Coast. That may not be enough. I mean, and in fact, it probably isn't going to be enough. So whatever numbers that are, this mortality rate that's increasing right now is increasing with all of the fully operational and fully capable medical staff and gear. Once that starts being overrun, there are going to be more and more deaths. And look, this all sounds like terrible news. And the reason it sounds like terrible news, it is terrible news. And look, I know there's a lot of people out there who think that this is, that still insist that this is all hype and that it's fear-mongering and that it's not true, it's false flag and all that stuff. Well, I think Native people have every right to be skeptical. They have every right, because of history, to say, I'm not sure I'm believing what the news is telling me. I'm not believing what the government's telling me. You have a right to be cynical. You have a right to be skeptical. But at some point, the truth on the ground starts to matter. So I think, and I'm there, and I know a lot of other Native people who I've known for years who said, nah, I don't believe any of this stuff. They're becoming believers, and it shouldn't take you having to lose a loved one to become a believer. If I can honestly say that I know somebody who has the virus now. One of the producers at WBAI was diagnosed positive. So I do know a human being personally that has the virus, not just some name I heard on television. So it starts to get closer and closer. All right, so here I am on the Cattaraugus territory of Seneca Nation. So how close is it to us here? Well, there was a brush with it, because one of the clinic staff members, a non-Native person who doesn't live on territory, was tested positive, but apparently hasn't infected anybody here. Thus far, the Cattaraugus territory here, and I'll include all of Seneca Nation, has not had anybody test positive with the virus. So thus far, there are none here. All of the counties around us, the 3 counties that are around the Cattaraugus territory or that surround the Allegheny territory, they have cases. even Cattaraugus County, which was a county that did not have any cases, they have one as of yesterday. I think one tested positive. In Erie County, they've tested. There's a bunch. There's like 350 cases in Erie County. Chautauqua County has at least 2 or 3, I believe. So those are the 3 counties that the Cattaraugus territory borders, and of course the Allegheny territory is considered within Cattaraugus County. Even from a township standpoint, on the Erie County side of the of the Cattaraugus territory, the towns close by, North Collins, where my son lives, where my grandson lives, whose birthday it is today. They had one case, and that one person infected 2 other people in their family. So now they're up to 3 cases. The village of Gowanda hasn't had a case yet, nor has the town of Brant, but immediately outside that there's a bunch. So it's kind of closing in, and that's why it is so important that we do everything we can to keep a distance, especially from the elderly, from our older folks, and try to not to look. Just don't go out and do any unnecessary social mingling. That's all we can say. All right, but I do want to talk a little bit more about. Well, look, I've got a bunch of things written down here. I guess to talk about the home front here. As many of you know, the Seneca Nation shut down its major revenue sources, the casinos. They shut them down, which was supposed to be just a 2-week shutdown. It's clearly not shutting down. I know they've laid off now. They didn't just suspend people with paid administrative leave. A bunch are being officially laid off, I think next week, by the end of next week or something like that. So that's happening. Which clearly means they aren't going to be opening up within a couple of weeks. So there's that, and that's has a huge impact to the Seneca Nation, because that is the source of their public finance. The finances for the Seneca Nation, 90% of them come or something like that comes from gaming revenue. So that's a huge hit to the Seneca Nation. Now, one of the things and I mentioned this early on when I first talked about the casino shutting down, is, the 800-pound gorilla in the room is still this $500 million. In fact, Ross John sat right beside me here talking about this. There's still $500 million that the Seneca Nation has set aside because of this fight that they're having with New York State, trying to squeeze them for revenue. Apparently, something rolled off the lips of the governor this week, citing again the need for that revenue, as if the Seneca Nation doesn't need it. I mean, look, the United States can just print more money. That's what they do, and that's what they did. That's essentially how they're bailing out Wall Street. It's how they put $2 trillion aside for this stimulus package that's supposed to help overcome some of what this has done to the American economy. The Seneca Nation doesn't have that luxury. They can't just print money, and so the fact that they've got this money sitting there, that they in their minds and by the language of the compact should not have to pay to New York State, and in fact they certainly aren't getting it. They certainly don't have an exclusivity today, because nobody's operating. You know who does? You know who does have an exclusivity for gaming? New York State. Their lotteries are still flying. Flying fine. They're still selling lottery tickets, and they've cornered the market on gaming. And again, I realize that it's not casino gaming, and some people can say, well, that's not really necessary. Well, I'm just saying it is what it is. So the Seneca Nation is still in the throes of this battle with New York State over this gaming revenue, and that conversation is probably going to heat up. Especially, it's going to heat up if the Seneca Nation has to start using those funds for operations, to operate the Seneca Nation. And I don't know how they're going to avoid it. They can't avoid it for too long. They don't have that much money set aside, a rainy day fund. This is exactly what this money could have been set aside for. but instead it's been set aside, as a potential extortion payment they have to pay to New York State. So I mentioned that early on in this as this thing was unfolding, and I think it's worth mentioning again, especially since, from what I understand, somebody must have pressed the governor. Said, "What about those damn Indians? Are they paying?" And he gave some response, I guess. Now, there's also another buzz, and I don't know if this is even true, because one of the sources of this information is something that I don't consider reliable, the Buffalo Chronicle. They suggested that the state is considering shutting down tobacco sales for 6 weeks. Now, I've watched some of the news conferences and that kind of stuff, and I haven't heard that. So I don't know where this guy, who writes this thing, gets that information. But that buzz has already made it back to the territory. And so the question ends up being, well, will the smoke shops on the territory shut down? Now, I got to address this. Even though it's only a rumor, and I can't put any substance to the idea that either the Seneca Nation or the private sector is considering shutting down their shops. Let's be clear. These are the only stores we have. We don't have grocery stores on our territory. Look, we're not in the food deserts that exist in some places, some other native territories. But if our stores shut down, and they are anchored by tobacco and fuel sales, so the fact that we have C-stores on our territory, they're convenience stores now, but they were just smoke shops at one time. Now they are full-service convenience stores where you can buy a loaf of bread, you can buy water or beverages, you can buy milk, you can get some necessities at these stores. If they have to shutter them because they can't do any tobacco sales, or if they have to lose money and operate at a loss. Look, some of that part of that business is probably a loss leader. It is probably not a huge profit margin. They make it on the gas and they make it on the tobacco. So the idea that the governor or anybody else out in the rest of the outside in the state would suggest, well, tobacco sales would be a good thing to shut down right now, and if you're going to try to make some medical reason for it, here's something I got to say about that as well. I'm not a fan of smoking. I'm not really a fan of smoking anything, just because I think the idea of breathing smoke into your lungs is probably not, and it's not to condemn smoking cannabis or anything else. I'm just not a fan of smoking in general. But having said that, I think there are people who smoke, and it is a coping mechanism, both tobacco and cannabis. We're going to praise these truckers that are over the road bringing, grocery items and the necessities that we need every single day across the road. I know a lot of truckers smoke, and you know what that smoke helps them do? It helps them stay awake. That nicotine gives them a charge. So while I'm not advocating cigarette smoking, I'm going to fully acknowledge that there are some short-term benefits that people get out of smoking. Whether it relaxes them, whether it's, again, a coping mechanism for stress, whether it's, whatever it is, even if it is just fulfilling the addiction need, it is doing that. If you think in a time of stress, you're going to take away tobacco, especially considering New York State and the governor said, well, liquor stores are an essential service. Alcohol sales are an essential service. So he acknowledges that. But if you're going to suggest that while alcohol sales is necessary, there's any consideration for prohibiting tobacco sales, look, Governor, if you plan to do that out there, then by all means do it. But I hope the Seneca Nation and I hope Seneca retailers and wholesalers are not seriously considering this. For one thing, just from a practical business sense, if the state does it, we're going to get a lot more business on our territories. I guarantee that. Now, that's a reason we don't have a whole lot of economic activity on our territories. That's one of the few things that we have. And I don't think that in the overall scheme of things with this whole COVID-19 scare, I don't think that we should shut this thing down. Most of the stores, including the store that's on the same property that my studio here is on, they've already, did some remediation that, you don't go in and touch everything in the store. It's almost like a drive-through. You go up there and you tell the clerk what you want, they give it to you. And, the gas station, for instance, doesn't even, it's pay at the pump. So they've already done some things, and most of the stores have already done something. Either they've shifted towards some sort of major drive-through or drive-through like service. I think that's enough precaution to take. So if there's any retailers or wholesalers out there listening, and I know I have a couple of retailers and wholesalers, and in fact even a manufacturer who's a sponsor of the show, don't cave to New York State. And I don't think that New York State even expects to impose this on our territories. But, one of the things that I heard, well, everybody's afraid the Seneca Nation is going to look bad. You know what? Bullshit. I mean, I don't think the state's always going to dog the Seneca Nation, and they always have anyway. They rarely ever say anything positive. If we ever do anything that contributes to New York State, it never gets mentioned. In fact, even the local towns, even when Byron Brown in Buffalo does his State of Buffalo speech, and he talks about economic development, barely even mentions the Seneca Nation. So, look, we don't need to kiss their ass to stay in their good graces. We need to do the things that are good for our people, and frankly, does provide a service to off territory. So, look, if there really is any consideration to shutting down tobacco sales in the state, I think it's a bad idea. I think you're really adding stress to a stressed population by doing that. Bottom line. But state, Governor Cuomo, if that's what you're doing, then have at it. But I hope the Seneca Nation is not considering following suit there. And I'll tell you, it concerns me. It concerns me that when the state adopts a policy, that the Seneca Nation or any other native territories follow suit with the state, almost as if they feel like they've got to comply with state law. Look, when they changed the smoking age from 18 to 21 or whatever, all the smoke shops did it. Well, if that was a good policy, then why didn't you do that before the state did? I mean, that's my point. If you think shutting down tobacco sales, and I'm not saying you are considering it, but if you think that's a good policy, then why are you waiting for the governor to tell you to do it? One of the things that I always found problematic, even with the gaming, not only do most gaming operations, especially almost all Class 3 gaming operations throughout all native territories, they operate under IGRA, which puts them in bed with the states. So if your argument is gaming is legal because of our sovereignty, well, you give a bunch of that away the second you slip into bed with the state. But even in the situations where you're saying that sovereignty is the reason that IGRA, Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, was passed, and even if you're selling goods there tax free, like gas and cigarettes, like the Seneca Nation has a one of their gas stations up there in Niagara Falls. The part that I find problematic is your alcohol sales are being done under a New York State liquor license. That just kind of blows my mind away. So, our relationship with the state is really, really touchy. And it's not good. And I don't mean it's touchy in a good way. I'm not touchy-feely in a good way. No, it's problematic. And, as I've talked on this show over and over and over again, when I talk about decolonization, it isn't just window dressing. I'm not saying let's throw the word sovereignty out there just, so it sounds good or feels good, rolls off our tongue well. No, we need to untangle ourselves from those systems of oppression. That's what decolonization is. It isn't about, having, a stronger name. It's about your actions. It's about what you do to assert that you are not under the authority of the state of New York or the United States. It doesn't mean you have to do everything that you can to fly in the face of what the state or the federal government does, or on the Canadian side of that imaginary line. Same with our territories there. We should do everything we can to maintain a certain level of distinction, and even as we have a cooperative, economic base, because much of our customer base comes from off territory. Look, there's ways of dealing with that. But make no mistake about it. There are times that those people who come onto our lands are problematic. So whether they come on to steal, or here's another example. Just this week, my buddy Matt says, "Hey, what did you think about the incident on the thruway this week, today or whatever?" I said, "What incident?" Apparently, in the construction zone of the thruway, which is on Seneca Nation land, some guy got pulled over by the cops and then ended up assaulting a bunch of state troopers, I guess, and it turned into a big brawl. And the construction workers got in to provide assistance to the cops, and then they found the guy had like a weapon and had a pipe bomb in his car. It turns out he was from Niagara Falls, and they found other explosives. I don't know what this guy was planning, but doesn't sound like he was planning a 4th of July celebration. At least not the one that most Americans have, I guess. But there's an example of people who come onto our territory. In this case, they may not seem, for many people say, well, he was just on the thruway. Well, like it or not, that's still Seneca Nation territory. And I haven't heard of much of a response out of Seneca Nation on this, by the way, either. But that's a whole nother issue. But again, I think it's, we understand that we aren't a remote territory in the wilderness. And many native territories are very, very separated from the non-native population. Ours isn't. And so we have to be concerned about how we deal, especially with this COVID-19, this coronavirus issue. We have to be concerned about it, and we should be. But it doesn't mean that we have to cave into everything the state says. And I think it's important that people realize that there are issues we are still strongly at odds with the state on a number of issues, including tobacco. I mean, let me again affirm this one more time. As far as the state's concerned, our tobacco sales are taxable as far as they're concerned. I mean, they'll admit, okay, we don't have the right to tax sales to Senecas. But as far as the state's concerned, every smoke shop filled with tobacco that doesn't have a New York State stamp on it is contraband as far as the state of New York is concerned. So there's no reason for us to comply with a state that regards us in this way. I mean, there's just no way that we should. They know they can't enforce certain things like trying to tax our sales. So why cave even if the state is considering shutting down tobacco sales? And this may be all about nothing. So, I mean, I don't want to make a big deal about this until this rumor has a little more meat on it. But I do have to say, to any native territory out there, if you've carved out an economy in spite of what the state has tried to do to you, don't cave in now, because the safety concerns as it relates to the coronavirus are no more than any other store that sells grocery items, and our stores do that as well. All right, hey, we're at the bottom of the hour, so I'll take a break and then we'll come right back. I do have some other things to talk about. I want to talk about what's happening in Mashpee, and maybe we'll even talk about this stimulus package a little bit. But we'll get into that when we come back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Yeah, Jake was just kind of filming. He looked up the guy from Niagara Falls. Apparently, he had his whole house rigged to blow up. I don't know. Crazy times. Look, there are crazy people in the world anyway. Add a global pandemic, and you might elevate that level of crazy. That's one of the reasons why I think the idea of trying to force people to go without cigarettes for 6 weeks. Look, I know that addiction is real, and this is a tough one. So, look, hey, this would be a good time for people to try to quit smoking, but I think the idea of any kind of forced government shutdown of something that like this is addictive. And for one thing, you're gonna make the what do they call those nicotine patches? You're gonna make those nicotine patches a run on those things. Look, it'll just be a crazy world. So if you're considering it, don't. Cuomo, if you're considering it, don't. Besides that, the state makes a bunch of revenue off of those sales too, including their their Tobacco Settlement Act funds. So just cool your jets here. All right. Couple of things. It's funny. You lock. when you live, no matter where you live in the United States, the two people you're seeing on the news the most on this thing happen to be Governor Cuomo, Andrew Cuomo, and Donald Trump, the president. And there's no question that Trump looks like a bloody idiot most of the time on the news. I mean, he just wanders around and he can't stay on topic. He can't even talk about anything, even a crisis, without talking about how wonderful he is, how wonderful a job he's done. I mean, he even suggested to the vice president that they should cut off any contact with any governor who doesn't appreciate what the federal government's doing. It's like they got to kiss his ass or something here. I mean, it's pathetic. But then you got Andrew Cuomo. I'm not a fan of Andrew Cuomo. Don't get me wrong, but there's no question the guy is far more articulate on his press conferences and that kind of stuff, on his daily news briefings and that kind of thing. And he's won over a lot of people. There are certain people who are suggesting that Cuomo for president all of a sudden. It's like that's becoming a thing. I hope not. But you know what? It doesn't matter who the president is, as far as I'm concerned. We face the same obstacles either way. But I'm not going to jump onto the Andrew Cuomo bandwagon, because I'm going to flat out tell you, I think Cuomo's actions were too little, too late as well. And I heard the last thing that he had said was that he believes the apex in these cases, these new cases, and the spread of this disease are still 14 to 21 days away. I don't know what he says. His experts are predicting that. I don't know what they're basing it on. If they're basing it on what South Korea and what China went through, there's no comparison on what China and South Korea did to stop to try to stop this thing. They locked people in their houses. They actually separated family members from the rest of their family to stop the spread. Most of the people who were tested positive, check the news. Most of the people who are tested positive, what you always see is they quarantined at home. Oh, really? Did they? They quarantined at home. So, in other words, they're still spreading the disease to their family members. Because how do you know, for one thing? I mean, and I know people are afraid of the draconian measures that China or even South Korea may have taken. But again, if you're going to compare what you think is the graph or the trend in the United States to a country that took much stronger positions on this thing, I don't think those numbers. You better compare yourself to Italy. You better compare yourself to Spain. These are two countries that are in dire trouble. And not to mention, I don't know that I completely believe all the numbers out of China. And not because I think they're trying to hoodwink anybody necessarily. I just don't know that once they stabilized their urban areas and they felt like they created enough space between the urban areas. China is a huge country with 1.5 billion people. I suspect they didn't test 1.5 billion people. I suspect if you look at all the people that tested, I don't know that they've tested a large percentage or a significant percentage of their population. They may just feel like we did enough. And so, I'm not calling China liars. I'm not trying to ridicule them or whatever else. I feel bad for any country that faces, including the United States. I'm not saying I feel bad for Trump. I mean, it just grates me to listen to the guy talk. I mean, but. And again, the likelihood is there's enough Americans that if they get a bunch of money sent to them, like Trump is promising, that they say, oh, well, he helped me out. I guess we'll vote for him again. I fear that Trump will get reelected because, in spite of the coronavirus and in spite of his poor response to the whole thing. But we'll see how that plays. By the way, any individuals who are really excited about the fact that they're going to have their unemployment extended or enhanced a little bit, and they might get a check in the mail. In Canada, I just saw this posted, so if it's not true, then I apologize. But I did just see this posted. Canada is offering $2,000 per month. I realize it's $2,000 Canadian, which is less, so I get it. They're offering $2,000 per month for the next 4 months. That's what I understand Canada's doing. And I'm not singing the praises of Canada. That's a whole nother issue. But anybody who thinks that the United States is doing so wonderful by its people, they're still throwing an ungodly amount of money at the rich to keep them rich. And that's what's going to happen out of this thing. So and I don't think there's any question about that. But it does invite the question, well, where do Native people fit in with the stimulus, either on the Canadian side or the U.S. side? Most of the criterion that is needed to receive money on the U.S. side, there's a large segment of the Native population, in fact, a large segment of the impoverished population that who may need money the most won't get it because they either they don't file taxes, they may be not in their system because we have cash-based businesses in our territory. We don't necessarily comply with all of the state and federal regs as it relates to taxing or or whatever. So my fear is that not only was this whole stimulus package designed not to reach everybody, I also know there's a lot of Native people who would say, hell no, I don't want any part of it. I'm not going to get a check from Trump, and I'm okay with that. I'm not, if one showed up in the mail with my name on it, would I throw it away? Probably not. And I'm going to tell you that. But I'm not expecting one, and I will do nothing to try to get a check from the federal government. Anyway, I mean, so, and I know that I'm not alone. There's a whole lot of people who feel this way. Where does this leave companies, for instance? Especially some of our companies. It does put these businesses that are on our territories in a tough spot. Is the casino going to get any corporate bailout from the federal government? I highly doubt it. I highly doubt it. I will say that the people who were employed by the casinos now who are going to be who are being laid off, and that's most of the people, they're going to collect unemployment. But you know what? They pay into that unemployment insurance, so it's justified. But I did want to put that out there. Okay, another thing that I want to talk about, because it is a news item that can get overwashed by all this stuff. Just because we're under the assault by a virus, by this pandemic, excuse me, doesn't mean that we aren't still under assault by, pipeline building, by extraction industries. All that stuff continues. Where I'm seeing, the folks in Wet'suwet'en territory are still under assault by these pipelines that are going through the territory. This stuff continues. Now, what about other stuff? Well, the Mashpee Wampanoag put out a statement today, or yesterday, I'm sorry, that they got word from the Interior Department that the lands that they have been living on, they have to be declassified as native lands. Yeah. So the lands that they're on, which they had acquired and put into federal trust and to be categorized as quote unquote Indian country, that's being overturned. Now, this has been an ongoing battle. And let me explain how this came to be. So during the Obama administration, the Mashpee had acquired land, and their intent was to pursue gaming, because that is one of the few things that we can do that can generate the kinds of public finance that would grant us any kind of independence. Although in gaming is in many ways the antithesis of independence, but regardless, excuse me, this is not a corona cough. This is upper respiratory in my throat. It's not a dry cough, and I don't have a fever. So the Mashpee they put an application in to place this land they've acquired into trust, and it would be considered Mashpee, tribal lands. All right. So that's what they did, and it was approved. Then there were complaints that there were some technicalities that were overlooked. Here's what one of those technicalities is, and I've talked about this on the show before, so let me explain this. There's this, when you look at historically how Native people were viewed by the United States, and other countries for that matter, we were recognized as a distinct people. The U.S. Constitution specifically carves out that we are not to be counted for representation in Congress. And so when in the apportionment clause of the U.S. Constitution, they refer to that we will not be counted for Congress, for congressional representation, and they identified as Indians not taxed. So they acknowledge that we were not only were we not taxed, but as those people not taxed, we are not supposed to be counted for representation. So we're not a part of the U.S. Constitution. We're mentioned in two other places in the U.S. Constitution, other than the apportionment clause. One of them was in the treaty clause, right alongside the executive, the President of the United States, negotiating treaties with foreign nations. They could negotiate treaties with Native people. And of course, that would require, consent from approval and consent from the Senate. But so we're mentioned in the treaty clause, right alongside foreign nations. In the Congressional Powers Clause, or what they call the Commerce Clause, which cites congressional powers, they say Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce in and amongst several states with foreign nations, in and amongst, so the Congress of the states, with foreign nations and with Indians, or Indian tribes, one or the other. So again, we are put right there alongside foreign nations in terms of our relationship with the United States. It didn't say they had the power to regulate commerce of Indians, but with Indians. That's what the U.S. Constitution says. So where does that leave us? It leaves us as a distinct people. And in fact, there's lots of language early on that, in spite of the doctrine of Christian discovery, where the United States talks about negotiating with us, treatying with us again, talks about our distinction. Even in quote-unquote New York State, there's a lot of language, and you get right up until the turn of the 19th century, into the 20th century, where that distinction is still carved out. But in 1924, let me back up a few years. In 1920, New York State started trying to figure out, well, wait, what is our relationship with Native people, and why are we paying some of these treaty obligations if it came from the United States? So New York State put together an Indian Commission that would explore the obligations and the claims that Native people had about sovereignty and that kind of stuff, land claims issues. And the New York State Indian Commission determined that Native people were owed a tremendous debt by not just New York State, but by the United States. Edward Everett, the guy who wrote this report, basically said, if the United States could spend millions of dollars in treasure and in blood fighting World War I, how could they not acknowledge the debt that they owe to the people who predate their existence? And how could they not recognize the distinction? And all of that, there's a lot of language in there. But included in that report was some of the dialogue that went between the State Indian Commission and the Federal Indian Commission. And the federal government was suggesting in 1920, well, maybe just make them all citizens. And the New York State Commission, this was a joint meeting, and they said, you can't just make them citizens. You can't just strip away their identity, and force them to be U.S. That's preposterous. And again, representatives from the State Indian Commission said that would be absurd. But lo and behold, in 1924, the U.S. Congress, state and House, passed the Snyder Act, and they makes it the Snyder Bill, I guess. No, Snyder it was a bill and then became an act. So they passed this law, and it would be more identified as the Indian Citizenship Act, where the Congress declares that all Indians within the continental United States were hereby considered citizens. Let me back that up again. Coming out of the Civil War, when the United States was still trying to deal with the whole slavery issue, they passed the 14th Amendment in 1868, I think it was, and they declared that anybody born in the United States and under U.S. jurisdiction was a U.S. citizen, and that was to include all slaves, essentially. And that presents itself even today as an immigration problem. This whole idea of where if somebody comes here and they're born and they give birth, that their child is a citizen just because they were born here. Well, so that's the 14th Amendment. But it says under the jurisdiction, and it says born within the United States. many of our native territories were still clearly not considered U.S. soil. Certainly Seneca's land, Six Nations territories were not. And we weren't under their jurisdiction. So that 14th Amendment didn't apply to us. In 1924, when they passed this Indian Citizenship Act, that's problematic too. There is a provisor in there that says, well, nothing in this law will should interfere with any tribal or property, or the property of Native people, which clearly it was intended to. But so in 1924 they passed a law. Now, we never asked for this. This was essentially a law that violated international law, which had already taken a position on the idea of denationalizing people, stripping away somebody's national character and imposing your own upon it. But you know what? They knew it didn't fly. Why did they? How do I know that? Because in 1934, 10 years later, they passed another law called the Indian Reorganization Act. And there's a lot of stuff in there. And in this Reorganization Act, which the intent was to do away essentially with traditional governance and create little municipalities, almost in this sense of U.S. federalism, as it's been called, to create these little constitutional governments within India and redefine what a Native person was. It was in 1934 that they came up with this definition of an Indian as a tribe, band, or nation of Indians subordinate to the laws of the United States. That's what a federally recognized Indian or Indian tribe was. But going after that, you still had there was still some question about who was under the jurisdiction of the United States. How do I know that? Because in the very system that the Mashpee Wampanoag were trying to use to put land into federal trust, there's language in this process that says if you were not under U.S. jurisdiction in 1934, you cannot put land in the trust. Wait a second. If you tried to declare that we were all citizens in 1924, and then clearly we weren't because you had to do this thing in 1934, and then if in 1934 you try to define all Native people as under U.S. jurisdiction, but then afterwards determine, there were people who were not under U.S. jurisdiction, and now you're going to punish those people by saying, regardless of whether you are a distinct Native people, regardless of even if you're federally recognized, if you weren't recognized in 1934 as being under the jurisdiction of the United States, we're not going to let you have land. We're not going to let you reclaim land under the fee to trust process. That's what the Mashpee have been stuck into. So when my friend Umi Perkins posts, the story about the Mashpee and said, asked John King, what's your opinion on this? Well, my opinion is clear. The reason I have a problem with FedRec, and I spell it WRECK, not REC, is because it's all about jurisdiction. It's all about subjugation. And that's what the Mashpee are facing right now. So what do they do with this land? The land isn't going to be taken away from them. They're still going to own it, but they're going to own it under state deed. It's no longer going to be considered, quote unquote, Indian land. So any plans that they had for that land that would have, been these enterprises that rely on Native sovereignty or our distinction goes away, including gaming. Oh, forget about that. So the Mashpee have a battle in their hands, and frankly, I'm all for sounding the horn and let's do everything we can to support them. This is such bullshit. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. I mean, and let's be clear. They didn't have to the Interior Department didn't have to change the designation. They didn't have to. And in fact, the federal government can do all kinds of things. The Seneca Nation has a very distinct provision in federal law under the Salamanca Lease Settlement Act, where the federal government, an act of Congress was passed to say, look, if you want to reclaim lost land, not in the fee to trust process, but in a process where you take it back to original title, we're including it in the settlement, and we're paying you a settlement on to settle how we screwed you on the Salamanca lease in the first place, and we're going to acknowledge that you have the right to use that money to require lost lands. and do it in a process that gives you full autonomy over that land. I mean, the provision in the Salomingly Settlement Act is only about a paragraph long. It's literally only a paragraph long. It streamlines the process. It is not this long, drawn-out, contractual, if-then, kind of thing. It's basically a 30-day process. Seneca Nation either buys the land or announces that they intend to buy the land, and the Interior Department has 30 days to determine whether there's any reason that this land should not be held under, be interpreted under the NonIntercourse Act, which means essentially that the land becomes theirs, never to leave their possession again. So the Senecas had that carved out. It's one of the reasons that I raised hell about Ruth Bader Ginsburg citing, the doctrine of impossibility with the city of Sherrill versus the Oneida Nation. There's no such thing as a doctrine of impossibility once the Seneca Nation enters into a new arrangement with the federal government that says, yes, they can reacquire lost land. So anybody who said you can't do that, or anybody who says the only way to do it is through the fee to trust process, Seneca Nation say, well, not for us. And if not for the Senecas, then why couldn't it be carved out for other people? Not the same provision, but another provision. And it could be. And shame on any of the states that are so hell-bent against Native people that they feel that they got to take these aggressive actions to try to strip our land rights away. That's what the Mashpee are going through. So if you think, in light of everything else that's happening in the United States, that somehow we've been granted a reprieve from aggression from states and from the federal government, think again. They are still we're still going through everything that we've gone through before. You still got the governor of the state of New York trying to extort $500 million out of the Seneca Nation, $1 billion really. You still have, pipelines that are being pushed through our territories on the U.S. and on the Canadian side. You still have aggressive actions from provinces, states, Canadian federal, U.S. federal. You still have all of that stuff going on. And what's happening with the Mashpee is just disgusting. And you know what? It's like everything else. Using their process to solve our problems is part of the problem. I go back to attending a consultation session in Washington on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and I kept hearing people from the federal government. They had a whole stage full of different agencies up there, and they says, "Well, the problem we have with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is that is whether it will change international law and upset our current remedy for conflicts with Native people." And they kept saying that. I says, what is this current remedy you're talking about? And they said, well, our court system. I says, so you think your court systems are the remedy for our problems with you? Don't you see a problem with that? You don't see that that's not an independent, arbiter of justice if it's your courts interpreting your law as it relates to somebody who arguably, we argue, were never even a part of your laws. And we've never accepted subjugation. We've never accepted the imposition or the transfer of our sovereignty to you. And yet, you're going to assume that your courts have the jurisdiction to deal with these issues, like land issues. In spite of the fact that the rest of the world, even as I was attending this consultation session, it was in 2010. 3 years earlier, the rest of the world already passed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples with all of that free, prior, and informed consent language. Not for the United States. No, the United States, and I have certain problems with using the word sovereignty, but one of the things that is clear is that the United States does not recognize, even as they, somehow, in some way, subscribe to the aspirations of this international declaration, they don't agree that we have the right to assert sovereignty on our lands. In fact, they distinguish the difference between self-determination and internal self-determination. They say when the federal government says things like self-determination, we don't mean self-determination in the international context of that phrase. We mean internal. We mean they can set up their own internal mechanisms, but we absolutely reject the notion that Native people can assert sovereignty over their lands. That's the position of the United States. So FedRec, relationships with the states, relationship with the United States, and this goes on the Canadian side as well. This is why we have the problems we have with U.S., Canada, Ontario, Quebec, New York, whatever state, whatever province, and why we continue to go through, through these conflicts, even when there's a dominant problem that we essentially should be all on the same page with. They can't even subside, set aside their aggression towards us, even as the world is facing a pandemic. That's it. All right, folks. I want to thank you for listening. Look, we're going to continue to do the show, so you can count us. I know I've had a few glitches over the last couple of weeks with technical problems, and we will work through them. When in doubt, this show can always be viewed on our YouTube channel, and whatever problems I cause or Facebook or anybody else causes, we'll resolve them as we post it up in a YouTube video. And of course, the audio is always good on our podcast as well. I want to thank you for listening, and we'll be back on Tuesday. Yahweh.